11 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, on June 26, 1943, 25,000 feet above the Pas de Calais, the air outside Robert Samuel Johnson's canopy was 40 degrees below zero. He could not feel his left foot. He could not see out of his right side window, because the plexiglass was coated in his own blood. The instrument panel ahead of him looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to a wristwatch. Every gauge was either smashed, smoking, or spinning uselessly in its housing. Hydraulic fluid was running down the inside of his thigh. The smell of burning insulation was so thick that he had unclipped his oxygen mask just to keep from coughing. His Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, tail number 416235, named Half Pint, was on fire, and the Focke-Wulf was still behind him. The FW-190A5 had been there for what felt like hours. In reality, it had been less than 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, the German pilot, whose name Johnson would never learn, although post-war researchers would spend decades arguing whether the man was Egon Meyer or one of his subordinates from Jagdgeschwader II, had emptied his entire MG-151 cannon load into the back of Johnson's airplane, 20mm shells, the kind of shells that were supposed to disintegrate a fighter on the second hit. He had been hitting Johnson on the third hit, the 15th hit, the 40th hit. Johnson, 23 years old, the son of an auto mechanic from Lawton, Oklahoma, had a strange thought drift across his half-conscious mind. He thought about the German pilots he had been told about back when he was training in P-43 Lancers at Mitchell Field in 1942. The instructors had warned them. The Luftwaffe knew what they were doing. They had been fighting since 1939. They flew machines that were lighter, faster in the climb, more nimble in the turn, and armed with cannons that could chop an American aircraft to confetti. Those instructors had said other things too, things that the new pilots whispered to each other at the bar in the evenings. The Germans, they said, had laughed when they first saw the P-47. Johnson did not feel like laughing. He felt like dying, but he was not dying. That was the strange part. The German behind him had fired everything he had, and the airplane around Johnson was still flying. Leading, smoking, hemorrhaging fuel from holes in both wings, missing chunks of vertical stabilizer the size of dinner plates, but flying, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder, 2,000 horsepower radial, designed by men who had never met Robert Samuel Johnson, but who had built him a chariot with the soul of an anvil, was still pulling him west. Toward the Channel, toward home. Behind him, the FW-190 closed in for the kill that would not come. This is the story of an airplane that everyone, Germans, Americans, the engineers who designed it, the pilots who would have to fly it, said could not possibly be a fighter. It weighed nearly 7 tons empty. It had a propeller 12 feet in diameter. Its supercharger ducting was so large that the rear fuselage looked pregnant. Compared to the Spitfire, it was a draft horse. Compared to the Messerschmitt 109, it was a delivery truck. The first time a Luftwaffe pilot saw a formation of them rumbling toward German airspace in the spring of 1943, he keyed his radio and reported, with the dry contempt of a man who has seen the future and finds it ridiculous, that the Americans had sent flying milk bottles to fight him. He stopped laughing 18 months later. By then, most of the men who had laughed alongside him were dead. This is the story of how that happened. How a 7-ton airplane with 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in its broad wings took the rules of aerial combat, the rules that the Germans had written across the skies of Poland, France, Britain and Russia, and burned them. How the laughter of Luftwaffe pilots turned, in the space of about 400 days, into a particular kind of silence that veterans never quite described in words. And how Robert Samuel Johnson, with 2 cannon shells lodged in his canopy frame 3 inches from his head, was about to fly the most famous P-47 mission of the war. But to understand that mission, you have to understand the laughter that came before it. April 15, 1943. The skies above Saint-Omer, in occupied northern France, were clear with high cirrus. Visibility unlimited. Wind out of the west at 18 knots. Perfect weather for fighter combat, if you happen to be a German fighter pilot stationed at Abbeville-Drucat, the home airfield of Jagdgeschwader 26, the unit the Allies called the Abbeville Boys, the most experienced fighter wing in the Luftwaffe's western inventory. The pilots of JG-26 were not afraid of much. They had seen the British come in 1940, swarms of Spitfires and Hurricanes climbing up out of Kent, and they had bled them down to nothing. They had seen the British come back in 1941, in the great fighter sweeps the RAF called circuses, and they had killed them again. They had seen the American B-17 Flying Fortresses begin their daylight bombing campaign in the summer of 1942, lumbering in tight defensive boxes across the Channel, and they had learned, through bloody experimentation, how to attack them. They had seen the Spitfire Mark IX, and they respected it. They had seen the P-38 Lightning, and they had already devised tactics for killing it. What they had not seen, what no German pilot had ever seen, because the thing had simply not existed 18 months earlier, was the formation that came growling out of the haze over the French coast that morning at 28,000 feet. Major Donald Blakesley of the 335th Fighter Squadron 4th Fighter Group was in the lead. Blakesley was an Ohioan, 25 years old, a former RAF Eagle Squadron pilot who had transferred to the American service when his unit was absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces in September 1942. He had been flying Spitfires for almost 2 years. He had been flying the P-47 Thunderbolt for 91 days. He hated it, or rather, he had hated it. He was beginning, in a way he could not quite articulate, to reconsider. Behind Blakesley, in a loose finger four formation, came 15 more Thunderbolts. Each one weighed approximately 14,500 pounds loaded for combat. Each one was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, displacing 2,804 cubic inches, producing 2,000 horsepower at sea level. And this was the part that mattered. 2,000 horsepower at 25,000 feet as well, because each engine fed its intake air through a General Electric turbo supercharger mounted in the rear fuselage. Each one carried 8 50 caliber AN/M2 Browning aircraft machine guns, 4 in each wing, with 425 rounds per gun. Each one, if you summed the arithmetic of its 8 barrels, could put roughly 104 bullets into the air every second, with a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. This was not common knowledge in the cockpits of JG-26. The Germans had been told that the P-47 had heavy machine guns rather than cannons, and they had drawn the obvious conclusion. The Americans had given their pilots an underpowered weapon. German doctrine was built around the 20mm cannon. The MG-150-120s and the wing roots of the FW-190 fired explosive shells. 1 hit would mission kill any single-engine fighter. 2 hits would generally tear the aircraft apart. The Americans, the briefing said, were sending men into combat armed with pea shooters. The first German pilot to spot the 4th Fighter Group that morning was orbiting at 32,000 feet in an FW-190A4 with yellow nose spinner markings. He keyed his radio. He gave the formation count, the altitude, the heading. And then he said, in the same casual tone a man might use to identify a parade of garbage trucks, that the AMIS had sent another batch of fat fighters across the channel. He used the word that would follow the P-47 through the rest of its operational life, Dick Bauch, fat belly. He had no idea. To understand why 8 machine guns mattered, and why fat bellies mattered, you have to understand the man who designed the airplane. His name was Alexander Kartvelishvili, although by 1940 he was signing his name Kartveli, and by 1943 the men who flew his airplanes were calling him Alex. He had been born in 1896 in Tbilisi, then part of the Russian Empire, in what is now the Republic of Georgia. He had fought briefly and badly in the Russian Imperial Army during the First World War. He had escaped the Bolshevik Revolution by way of Paris, where he had taken a degree in aeronautical engineering at the Higher School of Aviation in 1922. And he had come to the United States in 1927 as the personal protege of another Georgian aviation visionary, Alexander de Seversky, who had founded a small aircraft company on Long Island that would, after several reorganizations and one near bankruptcy, become Republic Aviation Corporation in 1939. Kartveli was a strange man. He spoke 5 languages, none of them well. He did most of his thinking on the back of restaurant napkins. He could not drive a car. He smoked 70 cigarettes a day. He believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who has actually lost his country to a faster ideology, that the airplane that won wars was not the elegant airplane. It was the airplane that could absorb violence and keep flying. In June 1940, with France falling and Britain bracing for invasion, the United States Army Air Corps issued a specification for a new high-altitude interceptor. The original requirement was modest, a light, fast, lightly armed pursuit ship in the European pattern. Kartveli read the specification, read it again, and then politely informed the procurement officers that they were asking for the wrong airplane. What the US would need, Kartveli told them, was not a copy of the Spitfire, not a copy of the Messerschmitt, not a copy of anything that already existed. The US would need a fighter that could climb to 30,000 feet without losing power, fly faster at 25,000 than anything the Germans were building, carry enough fuel to actually escort American bombers across the continent, mount enough firepower to destroy a fighter in a single firing pass. And this was the part the Air Corps men found most peculiar, be able to bring its pilot home with 200 bullet holes in it. The procurement board listened. The specification was rewritten. The contract for the XP-47B prototype was signed on September 6, 1940. What Kartveli built by the time the prototype rolled out of the Farmingdale, Long Island factory and lifted off Republic Field on May 6, 1941, was unlike any single-engine fighter that had ever flown. The wingspan was 40 feet, 9 inches. The length was 35 feet, 3 inches. The empty weight, before fuel, ammunition or pilot, was just over 9,900 pounds. The chief test pilot, Lowry Brabham, walked around it for 10 minutes before he climbed in. When he came down after the first flight, he stood on the ramp and laughed and said that he had just flown a flying brick. The flying brick, however, had done 112 miles per hour at takeoff, climbed at 3,000 feet per minute, and reached 412 miles per hour in level flight at 25,000 feet. That last number was a problem, not for Kartveli, for the Germans. The fastest production Bf-109 in service in mid-1941 could not exceed 380 miles per hour at any altitude. The FW-190, which was just entering service in the summer of 1941, could touch 400 miles per hour at low level, but began to lose performance above 20,000 feet because of supercharger limitations. The XP-47B got faster as it climbed. That was the trick. That was the whole secret of the airplane. It got faster because of the turbo supercharger. A standard supercharger, the kind the Germans used, is essentially a fan driven by the engine's crankshaft. It packs more air into the cylinders, but it consumes engine power to do so, and its efficiency falls off above 20,000 feet because the air outside is too thin to feed it. A turbo supercharger is different. A turbo supercharger is driven by the engine's own exhaust gases, which are wasted energy in a normal aircraft engine. Pipe those exhaust gases into a small turbine wheel, spin that wheel at 21,000 revolutions per minute, and use the turbine to compress incoming air. And you get a system that produces more boost as the airplane climbs higher, because the pressure differential between the engine's exhaust and the thinning outside atmosphere actually increases with altitude. It was a brutal piece of engineering. The turbocharger ran at temperatures hot enough to glow cherry red in flight. The ducting that carried its compressed air forward to the engine ran the entire length of the rear fuselage, which is why the P-47, viewed in profile, had the unmistakable bulge that gave it the nicknames Jug and Razorback. There was no way to make it small. There was no way to make it light. The airplane had to be designed around the plumbing, and the plumbing was the size of a small house. Kartveli, on a napkin somewhere in 1940, had drawn the following conclusion: if the airplane has to be big anyway, make it useful. Put 8 guns in the wings. Put 1,200 pounds of armor plate around the pilot. Put a 40,000 pound wing spar inside the structure. Build it like a tank. If the Germans laughed, let them. There was a problem, however. Several problems, actually. But the central one was this: nobody, anywhere on Earth, knew how to fly the airplane Kartveli had built. The first production P-47Bs reached the 56th Fighter Group at Bridgeport, Connecticut, in late 1942. The group's commanding officer was a 30-year-old major named Hubert Zemke, whom everybody called Hub. Zemke had been born in Missoula, Montana, the son of German immigrants. He had spoken German as his first language. He had been sent to Moscow in 1941 as a US military observer to teach Soviet pilots how to fly American-built P-40 Tomahawks, an experience he later described, with the dry economy of a man who had survived something he would rather not discuss, as educational. He was short, compact, intensely physical, and pathologically demanding. He believed, like Kartveli, that the airplane that won wars was the airplane the pilot could push to the edge of its envelope without thinking about it. His pilots, on arrival at Bridgeport, could not push the P-47 anywhere. They could barely fly it. In 4 months of training, September 1942 through January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots killed and 41 aircraft destroyed. None of those losses were due to enemy action, because there was no enemy. The men were killing themselves on the airplane. The P-47 had vices. It had several vices, and they emerged in sequence as pilots discovered them. The first vice was takeoff torque. The Pratt & Whitney R2800, turning a 12-foot, 4-bladed Curtiss electric propeller, generated so much rotational force on full power application that a pilot who failed to lead with right rudder would find the airplane swerving violently left across the runway. The second vice was the dive. The P-47 could exceed 550 miles per hour in a dive, faster than any other propeller-driven aircraft of the war, and at those speeds, the airflow over the wings began to behave in ways no aerodynamicist of 1942 fully understood. Pilots who pulled out too aggressively from a high-speed dive could induce compressibility lock, in which the controls froze solid because the air around them was approaching the speed of sound. The third vice was landing. The Thunderbolt, with its long landing gear and high cockpit, demanded a precise three-point attitude on touchdown, and any deviation produced a ground loop in which the airplane would pivot violently on one wing and tear itself apart on the runway. In the diary of 156th Fighter Group pilot, preserved in the archives of the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base, there is a passage from October 1942 that reads, in part, that the airplane was a coffin with wings, that the men who flew it would not survive the year, and that the only blessing was that it killed quickly. 3 weeks after that entry, the pilot who wrote it died on takeoff at Bridgeport when his propeller pitch control failed. Hub Zemke read those losses and concluded, in the manner of a man who is offered a problem and refuses to be defeated by it, that he was going to remake the entire training syllabus. He did. He ordered his pilots to fly the airplane at the edge of every envelope. He ordered them to take it to 35,000 feet, where no fighter had any business being, and learn what it could do. He ordered them to dive it past 400 miles per hour and feel the controls go heavy in their hands. He ordered them to bring it back again and again until the airplane stopped killing them and started obeying them. By the time the 56th Fighter Group sailed for England aboard the Queen Elizabeth in January 1943, Zemke believed he had something his pilots did not yet believe. He believed he had the most powerful fighter aircraft in the world. The Germans on the other side of the channel prepared to demonstrate to him that he was wrong. The P-47's combat debut over Europe took place on April 8, 1943, when 16 Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group flew an uneventful sweep over the coast of France. No Germans came up. The mission lasted 93 minutes. The pilots returned to RAF Debden with the same sour, anticlimactic disappointment that infantrymen feel after marching all day toward a battle that never starts. 7 days later, on April 15th, the Germans came up. It was Donald Blakesley, leading 3 squadrons of the 4th Fighter Group, who saw them first. 3 FW-190s, climbing fast from the direction of St. Omer, attempting to slash through the American formation in a single high-speed pass. The classic German tactic, the one they had used to kill so many Spitfires that the British had built doctrine around avoiding it. Blakesley, who had fought against this exact tactic for 2 years in Spitfires, did the one thing the Germans did not expect him to do. He pushed his throttle forward and dove. The FW-190 that came at him peeled off at the last moment, but Blakesley was already turning into the fight with everything the P-47 had. He closed the distance from 800 yards to 300 yards in less than 4 seconds. The FW-190 pilot, who had clearly assumed that the slow-climbing American fighter would also be slow in the dive, attempted to extend away. He could not extend away. Nothing the Germans had built could extend away from a P-47 in a dive. At 300 yards, Blakesley squeezed the trigger on the control column. 8 Browning machine guns fired simultaneously. The convergence point, the spot in the air where the 8 streams of bullets came together, was set for the 4th Fighter Group by Blakesley's order at 300 yards. He had set it deliberately. He wanted it close. He wanted, when he hit a German airplane, to hit it with everything at once. The FW-190's right wing came apart. Not the way the Germans expected an aircraft to come apart under machine gun fire, in a slow accumulation of holes and damage. The wing came apart in a single rending event, because the 8 Brownings, firing armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, put roughly 48 rounds into the wing root in the half-second burst Blakesley fired. The wing folded. The FW-190 spun. There was no parachute. This was the first P-47 kill of the war. The official credit, recorded in the after-action report, filed by the 335th Fighter Squadron, went to Major Donald J. M. Blakesley, U.S. Army Air Forces, on April 15, 1943, at 15:17 hours, location approximately 7 miles southeast of St. Omer, France. In the bar at Debden that night, Blakesley drank 1 beer, said almost nothing, and went to bed. He had been flying Spitfires for so long, and had distrusted the Thunderbolt for so long, that he could not quite admit, even to his closest friends, what he had just discovered. He had discovered that the airplane that nobody could fly, the airplane that the Germans called the fat-bellied milk bottle, the airplane that he himself had been writing letters to General Hunter requesting permission to exchange for any other fighter in inventory. That airplane, in a dive, was the most lethal pursuit ship that had ever flown over Europe. He went to bed thinking about that. The German pilots who survived that engagement also went to bed thinking about it. Their after-action reports, captured at the end of the war and translated by U.S. Air Force historians in 1946, used the German word überraschend. Surprising. It was a measured word for a measured profession. They were not panicking, not yet. But they were noting, with the slow, careful attention of men who have just witnessed something that does not fit their model of the world, that the new American fighter behaved in ways they had not expected. The day was June 26, 1943. The mission was a fighter sweep in support of B-17 bombers attacking the Villers-Coublay airfield south of Paris. The 56th Fighter Group, now operational from RAF Halesworth in Suffolk, was flying its 43rd combat mission. Captain Robert S. Johnson, 23 years old, was leading the second element of the 61st Fighter Squadron. Johnson had 4 confirmed kills as of that morning. He would, by November 1943, surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's First World War record of 26. By the time he rotated home in May 1944, he would have 27 confirmed victories, making him at that moment the highest scoring American fighter pilot of the European theater. None of that had happened yet. On June 26, 1943, he was a captain with 4 kills and a reputation among his squadron mates as a man who had a tendency to leave formation in pursuit of single targets, a tendency Hub Zemke had personally and repeatedly reprimanded him for. He was about to leave formation again. Just east of the French coast, at 28,000 feet, the 56th Fighter Group was bounced by approximately 16 FW-190s of Jagdgeschwader II. The Germans came down out of the sun at 350 miles per hour, firing on the deflection. Who saw the contrails of the diving Germans about 1.5 seconds before the rest of his element, did exactly what Hub Zemke had told him 1,000 times not to do. He broke hard left, out of formation, and went after the lead German. The lead German was not alone. The FW-190 that came in behind Johnson, the one whose pilot was almost certainly Egon Meyer, although the records remain disputed, fired a single, perfectly aimed burst of MG 151 20ths cannon fire from approximately 150 yards. The burst lasted less than 1 second. In that second, 20mm explosive shells walked across the rear fuselage, the cockpit, and the right wing of Johnson's P-47. One shell exploded in the radio compartment behind Johnson's seat, severing the rudder cables. One shell exploded against the armored back of Johnson's seat, driving the steel plate inward by approximately 3/4 of an inch, and lodging shrapnel in his right shoulder, his right thigh, and the side of his face. One shell exploded in the canopy frame, 3 inches from Johnson's right temple. One shell tore through the right wing root and ignited the gasoline in the right wing tank. One shell punched a hole the size of a dinner plate through the vertical stabilizer. Johnson, with shrapnel in his face and blood pouring into his right eye, attempted to fly the airplane home. The rudder pedals did not respond. The right wing was on fire. The canopy was jammed shut by the shell that had hit the frame, which meant he could not bail out. He could not see out of his right side. He could not communicate, because the radio was destroyed. He was bleeding from at least 11 wounds. The engine was still running. That last fact, the engine was still running, was the entire reason he survived. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, with each cylinder independently fed and independently lubricated, could survive damage that would have killed any liquid-cooled engine on Earth. A Daimler-Benz DB605 in a Messerschmitt 109, if it took a single .50 caliber round through its coolant system, would seize within 4 minutes. The R2800 could lose individual cylinders to direct hits and keep running on the others. It could lose its oil cooler and keep running. It could be hit by 20mm cannon fire and keep running. The R2800 in Johnson's half pint had 3 cylinders mission-killed by fragments, was leaking oil onto the cowling at a rate of approximately 1 quart per minute, and was running 50 degrees over redline. It kept running. Johnson, using only his ailerons and elevator and engine power for control, began the longest flight of his life. He turned west toward the channel. The fire in the right wing went out by itself when the gasoline burned through. The German fighter that had crippled him climbed away. He was alone in the sky for about 90 seconds. Then another FW-190 came alongside. This was the FW-190 that the legend would remember. Johnson could see the pilot's face. The German pilot was wearing a leather helmet and oxygen mask, and Johnson could see his eyes, and the German pilot was looking at him with what Johnson later described, in his memoir Thunderbolt, as the most curious expression he had ever seen on another human being. The German pilot was studying the damage to Johnson's airplane. He was looking, Johnson realized, at the holes. He was counting them. Then the German pilot dropped back, behind and slightly above, and opened fire. He fired everything he had. He fired his MG-17 Cowl machine guns until the ammunition counters in his cockpit clicked over to 0. He fired his MG-151 20th cannons until they too ran dry. He put bullets into Johnson's tail, his rear fuselage, his wings, his engine cowling. He fired enough rounds at the back of Robert Johnson's P-47 to have shot down any other fighter in the world several times over. The P-47 kept flying. The R-2800 kept running. The German pilot, in what subsequent investigators identified as the act of a man confronting something he could not understand, came forward one more time, drew alongside Johnson's right wing, looked at him for what Johnson said felt like a full 30 seconds, and then, in the universal sign of one professional acknowledging another, raised his gloved hand in a slow salute. He peeled away east and went home. Johnson made it to RAF Manston, 98 miles away, on the south coast of Kent. He landed wheels up, because the hydraulic system had bled out 2 hours earlier. Ground crew counted the holes. They stopped counting at 224. The official tally, recorded in the maintenance log of Half Pint, was that the aircraft had absorbed at least 21 cannon shells and over 200 machine gun rounds. The airplane was a total loss. Johnson walked away from it. He flew again 3 days later. Word of the engagement traveled, first through the 56th Fighter Group, then through the 8th Air Force, then through American newspapers, then, and this part is documented in captured Luftwaffe intelligence summaries, through the German fighter community. Pilots of Jagdgeschwader 2 began to make jokes about the American Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon that could not be killed. They were jokes the way men joke about things that frighten them. They were not laughing the way they had been laughing in April. The laughter, in fact, was beginning to acquire a different sound. By the autumn of 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had earned a nickname that the German radio interception services soon learned to dread. The Americans called themselves the Wolfpack. The Luftwaffe called them, in the encrypted dispatches captured after the war, das Zemke Geschwader, Zemke's wing. Specifically, the wing led by the German-speaking American who would not stop hunting them. Hub Zemke had become, by the standards of the European air war, an unusual commander. He flew every mission he could. He had a kill list of 17 confirmed German aircraft by the time he was shot down and captured in October 1944. He had a personal collection of grievances against individual Luftwaffe units, which he maintained in a notebook he carried in his flight jacket. And he had a tactic, which he had developed largely by trial and error in his first 6 months of operations, which would in time come to define the way the US Army Air Forces fought air-to-air combat. The tactic had a simple name. The pilots called it boom and zoom. Boom and zoom worked, in its essentials, like this. The P-47, which could not turn with a Bf-109 or an FW-190, would never enter a turning fight. Instead, the P-47 would climb to 30,000 feet, 5,000 feet above the practical ceiling of any German fighter in 1943, and patrol there. When German fighters were sighted below, the P-47s would dive on them, using the Thunderbolt's massive weight advantage to build speed. They would close from above, fire one devastating burst with all 8 guns, and then continue the dive, pulling out at low altitude with so much airspeed that nothing the Germans had could catch them. They would then climb back to 30,000 feet, look for more targets, and dive again. In other words, instead of fighting like a Spitfire, instead of fighting like an FW-190, instead of fighting like any fighter that had ever flown before, the P-47 would fight like an anvil falling out of the sky. The Germans had no answer for this. Their entire training program, refined over 4 years of war, was built around the concept of energy fighting, out-turning your opponent, getting on his tail, killing him from behind. The P-47 refused to engage on those terms. The P-47 did not turn. The P-47 dove, fired, and ran. It killed without ever giving the German pilot the opportunity to maneuver. The Germans, in their after-action reports, began using a phrase that Zemke later remembered with something close to affection. They called the P-47 attacks unfair. Unfair. Among the men who flew this style of warfare under Zemke's command, no one became more famous than Francis Stanley Gabreski. Gabreski, everyone called him Gabby, was a Polish-American kid from Oil City, Pennsylvania, the son of an immigrant grocer. He had failed pilot training the first time he attempted it, in 1941, and only made it through on a second attempt. He had spent the early war flying P-40s out of Hawaii, where he had achieved nothing of note. He had then volunteered to fly with the Polish 315 Squadron of the Royal Air Force in 1942, an experience that had taught him, he later said, what serious fighter pilots looked like. By the time he transferred to the 56th Fighter Group in February 1943, he was 24 years old and burning to prove that the men who had not yet noticed him were wrong. In the year and 3 months, he flew P-47s in combat, with the 56th, Gabi Gabreski shot down 28 German aircraft. He became the highest-scoring American fighter ace of the European theater, surpassing Robert Johnson's record. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 10 Air Medals. He was on his way home for 30 days of leave on July 20th, 1944, when he requested permission to fly one more mission. On that mission, strafing a German airfield at Bassenheim, he flew too low, his propeller struck the ground, and he crash-landed in occupied territory. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. He never lost a P-47 to enemy action. He destroyed his own airplane by trying to do one more thing for the war. The story of Gabreski, in many ways, is the story of the entire 56th Fighter Group. By the end of the war, the Wolfpack had been credited with the destruction of 665 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other American fighter group in the European theater. They had produced 39 fighter aces. They had transformed from a unit that was killing itself in training accidents in 1942 to a unit that the Luftwaffe specifically tried to avoid engaging by 1944. They had done it in a P-47 Thunderbolt, and by the spring of 1944, the airplane they were flying had begun to do something even Hub Zemke had not entirely anticipated. It had begun to win the air war over Europe. The week of February 20th through 25th, 1944 was called, by the men who planned it, Operation Argument. The men who flew it called it, simply, Big Week. The intent of Big Week, dictated by General Karl Spaatz and General James Doolittle and General Jimmy Doolittle's tactical commander, General William Kepner, was straightforward to state and impossible to execute. The intent was to break the back of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm before the cross-channel invasion of France in June. The method was to bomb the German aircraft industry, the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg and Augsburg, the Junkers plants at Bernburg and Aschersleben, the bearing factories at Schweinfurt, and to do it in such a sustained and overwhelming way that the Luftwaffe would have to come up and fight. Once they came up, American fighters would kill them, not the bombers, the fighters, the Mustangs and the Lightnings and the Thunderbolts. Big Week was the moment when the P-47, after 9 months of operations, demonstrated what it could do at scale. Over those 6 days, the U.S. 8th Air Force flew 3,300 bomber sorties. The fighter groups flew approximately 3,800 escort sorties, of which more than 2,000 were flown by P-47s. The Luftwaffe lost, by U.S. claim, 517 aircraft destroyed. The actual figure, as established by post-war German records, was closer to 350 aircraft destroyed and 450 pilots killed, wounded, or missing. That second number is the one that mattered. The Germans could replace aircraft. They could not replace pilots. By Big Week, the Luftwaffe had been at war for 4 years and 7 months. The men who had been trained in 1939 and 1940, the veterans who had crushed Poland and France and bled the RAF over Kent and gutted the Soviet Air Force in the summer of 1941, were finite in number. Once they were dead, no amount of factory output could put them back in cockpits. And the Luftwaffe had not anticipated, in 1939 or 1940 or 1941, that they would need to produce pilots in industrial volume, the way the Americans produced airplanes. The Americans had anticipated it. The Americans had been training pilots in industrial volume since 1942. By 1944, the US Army Air Forces was graduating 800 new fighter pilots every month. The math, in the end, was not complicated. The P-47, with its 8 machine guns and its boom and zoom tactics and its ability to absorb damage that would have killed any other fighter, was the engine that drove the math forward. Every German pilot a P-47 killed in 1944 was one less German pilot to fight in 1945. Every dogfight the Luftwaffe lost, even when it lost only 1 or 2 aircraft, drew down a reservoir of skill and experience that could not be refilled. By the end of Big Week, the German fighter arm had effectively been broken, not destroyed. It would fight on, fiercely, for another 14 months. But broken in the sense that it could no longer be relied on to defend German airspace against American daylight bombing. The Luftwaffe High Command, in a memo dated March 4th, 1944, and signed by General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch, reported to Hermann Göring that the fighter force was now suffering casualty rates of 40 to 50% per month on operational missions, and that this rate could not be sustained. It was not sustained. By June 6, 1944, when the invasion of Normandy began, the Luftwaffe was able to put a total of 180 fighter aircraft over the invasion beaches against more than 10,000 Allied aircraft of all types. They had been outproduced and outmanned and outgunned, and the airplane that had begun the destruction, The airplane whose pilots had borne the brunt of the fighting through 1943 and into 1944 was the airplane the Germans had called a fat-bellied milk bottle 10 months earlier. It was an airplane that did not, anymore, look very funny. Before we go on, it is worth pausing for a moment to talk about those guns, because the 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns in the wings of the P-47 Thunderbolt have a reputation that has occasionally drifted into mythology, and the reality is more interesting than the mythology. The AN/M2 Browning aircraft machine gun was a derivative of the M2 heavy machine gun originally designed by John Moses Browning in 1918. The aircraft variant fired the same 50 BMG cartridge, a .50 caliber round, half an inch in diameter, weighing approximately 700 grains, traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The rate of fire of an individual AN/M2 in aircraft mounting was approximately 800 rounds per minute, though combat reports suggest actual sustained fire rates were closer to 750 due to barrel heating. 8 of these guns, mounted 4 per wing in the P-47, with their barrels converging at 300 yards, produced a cone of fire that, at the convergence point, measured approximately 4 feet in diameter. Inside that 4-foot circle, in any single second of fire, were approximately 104 bullets. Each bullet carried roughly 13,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. This is more energy in a single second than a 4-inch naval gun delivered at the same range. The ammunition itself was where the system became truly devastating. The standard American .50 caliber load for aircraft use was an alternating belt of armor-piercing, incendiary, and armor-piercing incendiary rounds, with tracers spaced every 5th or 6th round for fire correction. The armor-piercing incendiary, designated M8, was a particularly nasty piece of design. Its core was a tungsten steel penetrator. Behind the penetrator was a charge of magnesium-aluminum incendiary compound. On impact, the penetrator would punch through aircraft skin and into structural members. The incendiary compound, ignited by the penetration shock, would burn at approximately 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum. When 8 P-47 guns fired a 1-second burst at a German fighter at 300 yards, the target aircraft was struck by approximately 100 bullets, of which roughly 30 would penetrate fuel tanks, hydraulic lines or structural members, and of which roughly 20 would deliver burning incendiary compound directly into those vulnerabilities. This is what destroyed an FW-190. Not the explosive shells the Germans had insisted were necessary, not the cannon fire the Germans had built their entire fighter philosophy around. A simple, brute, overwhelming hailstorm of 50 caliber bullets, each one carrying enough energy to break a wing spar, fired in such density that no aircraft built of aluminum could survive being inside the cone of fire for more than half a second. German post-war analyses of P-47 gun camera footage, conducted by the Bundesluftwaffe in the 1960s as part of NATO doctrine development, concluded that the 8-gun, 50 caliber armament was, contrary to wartime German assumption, more effective in air-to-air combat than the 20mm cannon installations on contemporary German fighters. The reason was not energy. A 20mm shell carried more energy than a .50 caliber bullet. The reason was probability. A burst of cannon fire from an FW-190 put, at most, 10 or 12 heavy shells into the air per second. A burst from a P-47 put 104 bullets into the air per second. The cannon could, theoretically, kill with 2 hits. The .50 calibers, given enough rounds in the air, would always score more than 2 hits. The math, again, was not complicated. It was just incredibly thorough. By the late summer of 1944, the war in the air had changed. The Luftwaffe was no longer a threat the way it had been in 1943. The P-51 Mustang, with its long-range and laminar flow wings, had taken over the deep penetration bomber escort role, for which the P-47 had once been considered the only candidate. Most of the famous American fighter aces, the Gabreskis and the Johnsons and the Zemkes, were finishing their tours, going home, or in some cases, sitting in Stalag Luft prisoner of war camps. The P-47, however, did not go home. The P-47 went to work. By the autumn of 1944, the U.S. 9th Air Force in France was operating 13 P-47 fighter groups in a role that nobody had originally intended for the airplane, and that turned out, in retrospect, to be the role for which it was perfectly designed. The role was tactical air support. The P-47 had become a ground attack aircraft, and the Germans on the receiving end of it had come to a new understanding of what flying milk bottles meant. A P-47, in 1944, could carry 2 500-pound bombs, or 2 1,000-pound bombs, or 1 bomb in a drop tank, or up to 10 5-inch high-velocity rockets, in addition to its 8 50 caliber machine guns and 3,400 rounds of ammunition. The total external load could exceed 2,500 pounds. The airplane that had originally been designed as a high-altitude interceptor had become, by accident of circumstance and by virtue of its enormous structural strength, the most effective single-engine attack aircraft of the war. The numbers by VE Day were staggering. P-47 units in the European theatre were credited with the destruction of approximately 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles including tanks, and 68,000 trucks. They flew 546,000 combat sorties in Europe alone. They dropped 132,000 tons of bombs. They fired 135 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The aircraft loss rate, in proportion to all that work, was extraordinary. The P-47 was lost at a rate of approximately 7 aircraft per 1,000 sorties, the lowest combat loss rate of any American fighter in the European theatre. The Thunderbolt's armor and structural strength, the qualities that had made it ungainly in 1942, made it the airplane pilots most wanted to be flying when they were taking hits from German anti-aircraft batteries in 1944. German soldiers on the ground developed a new vocabulary for the airplane. They no longer called it Dickbauch. They called it J-Bow, a contraction of Jag-Bomber, fighter bomber, and they used the word the way men use the names of weather events that have killed people they know. In after-action reports captured by the US Army in the spring of 1945, particularly from the German 7th Army during the Normandy breakout, the appearance of P-47s overhead is described in terms that have nothing in common with the dismissive transmissions of April 1943. Officers wrote that any daylight movement under clear skies was a death sentence. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself, on July 17, 1944, was severely wounded when his staff car was attacked by P-47s of the 405th Fighter Group near the village of Saint-Foy de Montgomery. He never returned to operational command. He was forced to commit suicide by the Gestapo 3 months later for his role in the July 20th plot against Hitler. A man who had survived the campaigns of Poland, France and North Africa, who had commanded the Africa Corps against the British 8th Army through the longest desert battle of the war, was effectively removed from the war by an American Thunderbolt strafing a road. The Germans had been very wrong about the airplane in 1943. By the time the last P-47 rolled off the Republic Aviation production line at Farmingdale, Long Island on December 21, 1945, the company had built 15,683 of them. This made the Thunderbolt the most produced American fighter aircraft of the war, surpassing even the P-51 Mustang. Republic had produced, in 5 years of wartime manufacturing, roughly one P-47 every 2.5 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The aircraft had served in every theater of the war. P-47s flew in the China-Burma-India theater, where their long range and heavy armament made them ideal for strafing Japanese supply columns through the Burmese jungle. They flew with the 35th Fighter Group in the Southwest Pacific, where the ultra-long-range P-47N variant, designed specifically for overwater operations, escorted B-29 bombers to the home islands of Japan. They flew with the Soviet Air Force, with the Mexican Air Force, with the Brazilian Air Force, with the French Free Forces, and with the Royal Air Force in India. The total Thunderbolt combat record, across all theaters, includes credit for the destruction of approximately 3,750 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. The total Thunderbolt combat losses against all causes were approximately 3,400 aircraft destroyed. The P-47 produced, over the course of its career, a list of American aces that read like a tour of the war. Francis Gabreski, 28 victories, Robert S. Johnson, 27, Hub Zemke, 17, David Schilling, 22, Walker Mahurin, 21, Fred Christensen, 21. The list went on. 62 American Thunderbolt aces in total, men who had come to the aircraft as second lieutenants and left it, when they left it at all, as colonels. Some of them did not leave it. The 56th Fighter Group lost 129 pilots killed in action during its time in Europe. The 78th Fighter Group lost 167. The 353rd lost 93. The 365th lost 142. Across all U.S. Army Air Force's operational P-47 groups, killed in action statistics totaled approximately 3,500 American pilots and aircrew. Most of them were in their early 20s. Most of them were buried in cemeteries in England, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy, where their families would not see them again. 8 machine guns, 2,000 horsepower, 7 tons of airplane, 43,000-foot service ceiling, 15,683 production examples, 546,000 sorties, 3,400 aircraft destroyed, 3,500 American pilots killed, These are the numbers. But the numbers are not the story. The story is the laughter. In April 1943, of a German pilot looking down out of his FW-190 at a formation of fat-bellied American fighters climbing slowly toward him. The story is the silence, in April 1945, of the same air over the same fields, in which no Luftwaffe fighter rose to challenge the Thunderbolts that now ranged unopposed across the burning ruins of the Third Reich. The story is what happened in between, what 8 Browning machine guns, mounted 4 per wing in an airplane that nobody on either side believed could possibly be a fighter, did to an air force that had been considered, in the autumn of 1942, the most professional and most experienced fighter arm in the world. Robert Samuel Johnson came home in the summer of 1944. He toured America selling war bonds. He wrote a book called Thunderbolt, published in 1958, which became the standard pilot's memoir of the European Air War. He flew for Republic Aviation as a test pilot through the 1950s. He left the company in 1965, worked in insurance for the rest of his career, and died in 1998 at the age of 78. He is buried at Whispering Pines Cemetery in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Francis Gabreski survived German captivity. He returned home in 1945, served in the post-war Air Force, flew F-86 Sabres in the Korean War, with a 4th Fighter Interceptor wing, and shot down 6.5 MiG-15Es, making him one of only 7 American pilots to be aces in both World War II and Korea. He retired as a colonel in 1967 and died in 2002 at the age of 83. Long Island MacArthur Airport, near the old Republic Aviation factory at Farmingdale, includes a terminal named in his honor. He is buried at Calverton National Cemetery on Long Island, less than 15 miles from the field where the airplanes he flew were built. Hubert Zemke survived German captivity as well. He had been shot down on October 30th, 1944, when his P-47 broke up in a thunderstorm during a mission over Germany. He spent the last 6 months of the war as the senior American officer at Stalag Luftwaffe in Barth, where he organized the prisoners, prevented an SS attempt to evacuate the camp in April 1945, and turned the entire complex over to advancing Soviet forces. He retired from the Air Force in 1966 as a colonel and died in 1994 at the age of 79. Alexander Kartveli continued to design aircraft for Republic Aviation after the war. He designed the F-84 Thunderjet, the first American jet fighter capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. He designed the F-105 Thunderchief, which flew the most dangerous bombing missions of the Vietnam War over Hanoi. He designed the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the ground attack aircraft named in tribute to the P-47, which is still flying with the U.S. Air Force today, and which carries in its design philosophy heavy armor, brute structural strength, overwhelming firepower in a relatively slow airframe, the unmistakable signature of the man who, on a napkin in 1940, decided that the airplane that won wars was the airplane that could take a beating and keep flying. Kartveli died in New York in 1974 at the age of 77. His ashes were returned to the Republic of Georgia in 1996. The Republic Aviation factory at Farmingdale, where every P-47 was built, closed in 1987. The site is now a museum, a community college, and a strip mall. The airfield is still there. On clear days, if you stand at the western end of the runway and look east toward the wind, you can see the outlines of the old hangars, and if you know what to listen for, you can sometimes imagine the sound of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine being run up on test stands at the far end of the apron, 18 cylinders firing in sequence, 2,000 horsepower coming alive, the air shaking around the wooden hangar walls. There are not very many flying P-47s left in the world. Perhaps a dozen, in private collections and warbird museums, restored by men who pay enormous sums of money to keep them airworthy. When one of them passes over an airshow crowd at low altitude, the sound it makes is unlike anything else in the sky. It is the sound that Robert Johnson heard when his half-pint somehow kept flying with 200 bullet holes in it. It is the sound that German pilots learned between April 1943 and May 1945 to recognize and to fear. It is the sound of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 at full throttle, the propeller chopping the air at 1,200 revolutions per minute, the turbocharger spinning at 21,000 RPM, and the entire weight of 7 tons of American engineering coming overhead. It is a thunder that takes a moment after the airplane is gone. There is a tendency in the way these stories get told to make the airplane the hero, to say that the P-47 won, to say that 8 Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare, to say that fat-bellied American fighters, sneered at in April 1943, terrified the Luftwaffe by April 1945. All of that is true. It is also incomplete. The aeroplane did not win. The men who flew the aeroplane won. Specifically, the men who flew the aeroplane in 1943, when nobody yet believed in it, the men of the 4th and the 56th and the 78th fighter groups. The men who took an unfamiliar machine into combat against the most experienced fighter arm in the world, and who lost friends in training accidents, and lost more friends in early combats, and who learned, in the only way air combat can be learned, that the airplane they had been given could do things they had not yet imagined it could do. The men who took Hub Zemke's strange new tactic of climbing high and diving fast and made it work, mission after mission, until the Germans had no answer for it. And the men who built the airplane. Alexander Kartveli on his napkins, with his cigarettes. The 30,000 workers at the Farmingdale plant, most of them women, most of them working 3 shifts a day. The engineers at Pratt & Whitney, who designed an engine that could take a 20mm cannon shell and keep running. The metallurgists at Curtiss, who built propellers strong enough to handle 2,000 horsepower at 27,000 feet. The ordnance men at Frankfurt Arsenal, who packed armor-piercing incendiary cartridges into belts of 250 rounds, 425 rounds per gun, 8 guns per airplane, 15,683 airplanes. It is easy, 80 years later, to talk about what 8 machine guns did to the Luftwaffe. It is harder to remember what those 8 machine guns required. They required a country willing to spend the gross domestic product equivalent of a small nation on building airplanes. They required a generation of young men willing to climb into those airplanes and fly them at unfamiliar targets in unfamiliar weather over unfamiliar countries. They required engineers and pilots and ground crews and ammunition handlers and Red Cross nurses and parents at home who put stars in their windows. The German pilot who laughed in April 1943 at the milk bottles climbing toward him was wrong. That he was not wrong because the airplane was ridiculous and turned out not to be. He was wrong because he could not see, behind the airplane, the country that had built it. He could not see the factory at Farmingdale. He could not see Alexander Kartveli hunched over a napkin. He could not see Hub Zemke demanding that his pilots take the airplane to 35,000 feet. He could not see Robert Johnson, 23 years old, son of an Oklahoma auto mechanic, who would one day fly a P-47 home with 224 holes in it. He saw, in April 1943, an airplane. He should have seen everything that came with it. That is the lesson of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Not that one machine, one weapon, one design philosophy defeated the Luftwaffe, but that, when a nation pours itself entirely into a war, the things that nation builds carry with them more than steel and aluminum and machine guns. They carry the patience and the rage and the productive fury of the people who built them. And sometimes those things look ridiculous on first viewing to the men they are about to kill. The Germans stopped laughing in 1944. By 1945, most of them were dead. The airplane that they had laughed at, with its 8 Browning machine guns and its 2,000 horsepower engine and its absurd, pregnant, plumbing-stuffed rear fuselage, had outlived them. It had outlived their pilots, their air force, their regime, and their war. It had become, by simple persistence and overwhelming firepower, the answer to the question they had not known they were asking. The question was, how do you kill the most experienced fighter force in the world? The answer was, with 8 Browning machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing of a 7-ton American fighter, fired in 2-second bursts at 300 yards by a country that built 15,683 of them. The Germans never came up with a better answer. If this story moved you, if you've made it this far, take a moment to do a few things. Hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about this kind of history. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell, because next week we're telling another story you probably haven't heard, about a different aircraft, a different crew, and a different moment in the war that didn't make it into the textbooks. In the comments, tell me where you're watching from, and whether your family has a connection to the P-47 or to any of the men who flew it. The pilots and ground crews of those Thunderbolt groups had families, children, grandchildren. Many of them are out there watching channels like this one. If that's you, please share. The history belongs to all of us, but it lives in the memories that families pass down. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep the thunder in your hearts.